There isn't anybody, I think, in the state of New Jersey who is better suited, experienced, temperament, brain to talk to us about what's effective in community activism in the state and nationally. And I am greatly honored to introduce to you the lawyer, Jim Johnson.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that generous introduction, and hopefully I have a few pearls left. Washington is in chaos. It is the picture of chaos right now. And while we are feeling it is wonderful to be here in this room and to see what democracy looks like, if we travel down to Washington, it is completely chaotic. I'm here to talk to you about the power of community to defeat chaos. We've already seen it happen. We saw it happen with the defeat of the efforts to repeal and replace with something skinny, the ACA. Community triumphed over chaos. Community trumped chaos. And I want to talk to you about how you can carry forward the triumphs that we've seen in the last couple of months and really build something strong. And I'm not talking about something strong in terms of winning on particular issues. I'm not talking about even getting a particular candidate in office. I'm talking about restoring our democracy with a fundamental building block, and that building block is community. There are some things that are essential, in my view, to a vital, vibrant community. It's not agreement, it's trust. It's not conformity. It's trust. It's not even consensus. It's trust. In fact, in a vital community, you will always have some degree of conflict. You will always have some degree of dissension. But a strong community, a community that is actually based upon trust, is strong enough to hold the tension, hold the disagreement within us. We are an extraordinarily diverse state. We're an extraordinarily diverse country. Not only diversity in the sense that I grew up with it when in the 60s, when we were only talking about really divides between black and white, but the divides have multiplied. That's one way to look at it. Or the variety has multiplied. The new points of view have multiplied. And the new opportunities for us to be strengthened have all multiplied. One of the things that we saw in the months since November 8th was a dominant view that things can't change, that the money within the system, that the newfound conservatism within the system is now undefeatable, that you don't have reasons to hope. And I'd like to offer this quotation from Rebecca Solnit, who wrote a book called Hope in the Dark, and I commend it to all of you. And she said this: "Your opponents would love you to believe that it's hopeless, that you have no power, that there's no reason to act, that you can't win. Hope is a gift you don't have to surrender, a power you don't have to throw away. But hope is not enough. There are reasons to hope." And what we saw within the last 10 days with the defeat of the effort to repeal the ACA is one reason to hope. Recently in the New York Times, there was an article about who do we thank? Who should we thank for this defeat? By David Leonhardt. And he started with people who were not involved 10 months ago in the political process. He started with a school teacher, Jessie Bowen. She was in Tennessee. She decided to become involved in the indivisible movement. She decided to attend town hall meetings. She decided to speak up and let her voice be heard. And Jessie, a person about whom no one had heard 6 months ago, went viral. And she went viral not just because of her own voice, because of so many other voices that were joined with her. This is not a new phenomenon. When you look at all of and this was a major legislative victory. If there are folks that in my generation who were sad that they had missed the civil rights era, they had missed the 60s, they had missed the big legislative changes, they had missed all these things. You just lived through a huge legislative victory, and you are responsible for that. You should take pride in that and encouragement as we move forward. But going back to the 60s and sort of my perspective on these things, I don't remember the March on Washington. I was 3 years old, just about 3 years old when it took place. But we grew up with it. And I didn't just grow up with it because of the history that I learned in school. I grew up because we had Martin Luther King Day celebrations, and he was an iconic figure along with the Kennedys in our family. I grew up because I was reminded that if Martin Luther King had shown up in August of 1963 and no one else had shown up, he would have been considered a crazy person, a prophet talking to himself on the monument. But he didn't have no one to listen to him. He had more than 100,000 people there. And he had people there because of someone many people like Letty Johnson. You've never heard of Letty Johnson. But if Letty Johnson hadn't existed, I wouldn't be here because she was my grandmother. She was a maid. She was not a person of letters. She maybe had a 9th grade education. But she was also the secretary of the Bayonne branch of the NAACP. And her job was to organize the buses to go down to the March on Washington. And because of the Letty Johnsons all over the country, not only was there this great setting for this speech and this impetus for the Kennedys to move, but we ended up with the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. It was these individual, small, supposedly anonymous efforts that created this wave of motion that carried the nation from a state of essentially apartheid in the South to one in which ultimately we were able to have an African-American president. You are part of that tradition if you continue to persist, if you continue to move forward. We are still, notwithstanding this triumph, at a moment in which, as I mentioned, Washington looks like chaos, and there were chuckles, but it's also deeply concerning. In Washington right now, while we are pleased that, at least for the time being, the prevailing wisdom seems to be that as we deal with the ACA moving forward, it is mend it, don't end it, rather than repeal and replace it or just repeal. That's a significant achievement. But our nation's capital is in such a state of disarray that we're really not able to pay much attention to the fact that North Korea now has at least a missile powerful enough to reach the West Coast. That we are investigating whether or not Russia colluded in the election, and we don't have a policy in Russia that makes sense to us, that's coherent. Although now we have sanctions in place, but the president says they're a bad idea. We have a host of issues that are not being dealt with, in part because the temperature has been ratcheted up so high. We have been almost forced to react to the changes from time to time by Twitter of the occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, that we're not able to reasonably, sensibly think through all of the important issues that are facing us both in Washington and in our state. And what's so important about your coming together today is that you are, in the exercises and the working sessions that you're going to have after this discussion, dealing with the essentials of, I think, it's going to take to rebuild our nation. I do not believe that it's enough in responding to the mess that's coming out of Washington to have another set, our side of the issues, whatever our side happens to be. What we need to do is fundamentally change the way we engage with each other, the way we listen to each other, the way we reason together or don't. And so as you debate the issues of whether or not you should be more forceful, remember what's been accomplished with quiet force. As you consider whether or not we need to be extraordinarily more confrontational, remember that at the end of the day, take for example the Tea Party, they were confrontational at every single turn. And finally they got to the point where one party controls all the three branches of government, and it turns out they couldn't actually organize a two-card motorcade. And we're thankful for that disarray. But what that means is that we shouldn't adopt all of their tactics. And particularly if we want to restore community. It's one thing to restore whatever party you're in, and to restore the strength of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. But remember, the parties in themselves are a means to an end. For me, the goal is to restore a sense of strong community, which is what you are doing today. Restoring a sense that there's a reason to trust each other and to trust government. Brian Stevenson says that it's proximity that brings about real change. We're in New Jersey, so I would say that social change is a contact sport. But that means actually we just need to get close in. We need to listen to each other. We need to understand each other. As I said, we are in a troubling time, but this is not the first time this nation has been in the middle of troubling times. I'll go back to the 60s as a point of reference again. On April 4th, 1968, I was a kid of only 7 years old, and I was in my mother's bedroom, and Dad came in, and he was dressed in a way unusual for that moment because he still had his hat and his coat on. And the reason he did was that he had news that he had to deliver to Mom. And I was a little kid not paying much attention to the world. I had Lincoln Logs and Hot Wheels in front of me, and that was my focus. And then my father said this: they killed Martin Luther King. And I don't remember my mother sobbing before, and not much since. But she broke into sobs at that moment. And for me, it was clear that something hugely dramatic had changed in the world. Now, at that same moment, when my father was delivering the news to us, Bobby Kennedy was in Indianapolis. He was moving into an African-American community to give a speech. He was in the middle of what became his last campaign. A glorious set of days that was around trust, moved around love, moved around trying to bring our fractious nation together. And his staff has said, you know something, you can't even go here. We don't know what's going to happen. And instead he went. And I want to offer to you these words of Kennedy because they are about the core of this enterprise, restoring our democracy, giving promise, living up to the full promise of this nation, and building trust and understanding. Kennedy said this. He spoke for a little bit, and he gave the news first that King had been killed. When he walked to the platform, people were shouting, they were screaming, "Happy to see you," and started to chant Kennedy, and they had signs. And the first thing he said was, can you lower those signs, please? Can you lower those signs? And if you've ever listened to the tape, you can hear the mournful quality in his voice. And he moved from that moment of lowering the signs to then delivering the news. And when he said that King had been killed, Martin Luther King had been shot and killed today, there were people that had screamed. And then he went on with his speech. And he talked about the fact that people may respond with hatred because the apparent evidence was that it was a white man that had murdered him. And then he talked about his own family's loss. It was a moment of empathy for him, as well as just being a politician responding to the needs of his constituents. And then he said this: "For those of you who are black, considering the evidence evidently is that there were white people who were responsible, you can be filled with bitterness and with hatred and a desire for revenge. We can move in that direction as a country in greater polarization, black people amongst blacks and whites amongst whites, filled with hatred toward one another. Or we can make an effort, as Martin Luther King did, to understand and to comprehend, and to replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that has spread across our land, with an effort to understand compassion and love." And that's what you are about to do, to sit down and reason together and talk through, listen to each other about what your concerns are. You know, during the second to last campaign, not mine, but Hillary Clinton's campaign, I did a little bit of canvassing in Pennsylvania. And I did what I was told not to do as a canvasser. I actually talked to people who were Democrats who said they were going to vote for Trump. I was told that if they tell you you're going to vote for Trump, walk away. And to me, that ran against two instincts of mine. One, why embed distance in our own campaign effort? And the other was, I actually don't usually follow rules anyway. And I talked to Trump supporters, and you definitely heard the hair on fire Hillary Clinton conspiracies. But then I heard this: we've lost a sense of community. We don't have good jobs. We're tired of being told who our leaders are supposed to be. And then one gentleman, and I was surprised at this, and he looked at me and he said, "And on issues of race, I served in Vietnam, and we were blacks and whites. We were like brothers, and now I feel we're so far apart." And the next day, a Sunday morning, I was at Shiloh Baptist Church in Newark, and during the pastoral prayer, we heard the same things. We've lost a sense of community. We need good jobs. No one is listening to us, and we don't get to choose our leaders. And there are lots of other analyses that have been done about Trump voters and about race. There are lots of discussions about Democratic voters. But at the end of the day, and some people have said, well, don't worry about the Trump voters anymore. Let's pivot someplace else. But at the end of the day, Trump voters are actually electing members of Congress. And unless we can actually figure out a way to split our nation into completely separate geographic camps, we will have to live together. And Martin Luther King said, we will either live together as brothers or we will die separately as fools. And I believe my mom didn't raise any foolish kids, and I don't think anybody in here was raised, their parents raised any foolish kids, which means that the work that we do to come together, to listen, part of the process that you're engaged when you be engaged in round tables is really trying to seek to understand before you seek to be understood. That is the core of a deliberative democracy that will save this nation. Not anything as Elizabeth said, coming down from on high, but what comes from right here and the 7,000 people that you represent. That is what democracy looks like. That is what's going to build trust. That is what's going to enable us to actually have a vital, vibrant community in which we can hold the tensions between us and in which we can all together move forward. I am so grateful for your work. I am so grateful, and my friends and families members who actually don't have health insurance or wouldn't have health insurance but for the ACA are deeply appreciative for what you've done and what you will do going forward. And I'm looking forward to the results in November 2018. Thank you so much.